So you're keen to get a handle on how we actually measure the sustainability of our cities. You want to cut through all that dense research and really get to the heart of it.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing today.
Good. This is our deep dive into the research landscape of urban sustainability indicators. We're aiming to give you the essential insights without, the headache of sorting through hundreds of academic papers yourself.
Exactly. And our main source here is a pretty hefty bibliometric review. It also includes thematic analysis, looking at 205 papers from the Scopus database, all focused on these indicators for sustainable urban planning.
Okay.
So think of this as your guided tour through what the research world is talking about, the big trends, and maybe where things are headed in this really crucial field.
Right. Let's unpack this then. We all know cities are growing, expanding like crazy, really. By 2050, I think the prediction is nearly 70% of us will be living in urban areas.
That's the figure, yeah. Almost 7 out of 10 people.
Which is huge. And while cities drive progress, this kind of growth brings, serious challenges, doesn't it? Environmental damage, resources stretched thin, social divides getting wider.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why sustainable urban development is so critical now. It's all about striking that balance, meeting today's needs, environmental, social, economic dates, without wrecking things for future generations.
And urban planning is right at the center of that.
It has to be. And to actually make progress, we need solid ways to measure, to assess how sustainable our cities really are. Otherwise, how do we know if we're heading in the right direction?
Which brings us neatly to these urban sustainability indicators. Now, this study, it wasn't just a casual look at a few articles. They systematically analyzed 205 papers. How on earth did they start to make sense of all that?
Well, they used something called bibliometric analysis. It's basically a way of mapping a research field. You look at publications, who's citing whom, what keywords keep popping up.
Yeah.
It helps understand the structure and how it's evolved over time. They use specific tools, things like VO's Viewer and the Bibliometric's R package, to help visualize these connections and pinpoint the main themes bubbling up from all that research.
Looking at 205 papers, I imagine that threw up some interesting patterns, maybe beyond just seeing more papers being published. Any surprises in what kind of research was happening or where it was focused geographically?
Well, the acceleration itself is quite striking. The study found a really significant jump in publications just in the last 5 years. It clearly shows this topic is getting way more urgent attention from researchers.
Right, makes sense.
And interestingly, the key words that always came out on top were sustainable development, sustainability, and urban growth. No big surprises there, perhaps, but it really confirms the core issues driving all this work.
So within this growing field, what are the main areas researchers are really digging into? What are the sort of big buckets of knowledge they're exploring?
The analysis pointed to 3 main thematic clusters that kept coming up. First, there's the whole area of frameworks for urban sustainability assessment. Second is research and models for the smart city. And the third theme centers on stakeholder engagement and implementation strategies.
Got it. 3 big areas. Maybe we should break those down a bit.
Yeah, let's take them one by one. It'll give a clearer picture.
Perfect. Let's start with those frameworks for assessment. What are they fundamentally trying to achieve?
Okay, so these frameworks, they're essentially structured ways to evaluate how sustainable a city is across different dimensions. They usually use a set of indicators to measure things.
Like what kind of things?
Well, environmental aspects, biodiversity, energy use, waste, air, water quality. Then social factors, think equity, housing, health, education. Economic elements, too, like jobs and GDP. And even governance, things like policy and public involvement.
Right, so it's trying to capture a really complex picture, lots of moving parts. Has the way researchers approach these frameworks changed much over time?
Yeah, it has evolved. Early on, the focus was more on just establishing some basic criteria and indicators. But the trend now is towards much more comprehensive and, importantly, context-specific approaches.
Meaning?
Meaning there's a growing push for quantitative data, actual hard numbers, and for frameworks that cover all the key bases, not leaving gaps. Researchers are also really stressing the need for data-driven indicators and recognizing that what works for one city or region might not work for another. You need to consider those differences.
That makes sense. The study also mentioned something interesting. Using a city's own master plan as a tool for assessment. How would that work?
Exactly. That's a potential solution to some challenges, like data gaps or making sure the assessment fits the local reality. The idea is, instead of creating a whole new framework from scratch, you could use the city's existing master plan, its strategic development document, as the basis for assessing sustainability.
Ah, okay, so it ties the assessment directly to what the city is already planning to do.
Precisely. It could make the whole process more relevant, maybe more adaptable, especially in diverse urban contexts.
Interesting idea. Okay, the second big theme you mentioned was research and models for the smart city. We hear that term smart city all the time. What's the core concept being studied here?
Right. So at its heart, the smart city concept is about using information and communication technologies, ICT, to make city operations more efficient.
Like managing traffic or power grids?
Exactly. Things like optimizing traffic flow, managing energy better, improving public services. The overall goal is usually framed as improving urban life. There's a common model that breaks it down into 6 parts: smart economy, people, governance, mobility, environment, and living.
But it's not just about the tech itself, is it? It's about the impact.
That's a really important point, and the research reflects that shift. Initially, maybe the focus was very heavily on the technology, but the research shows a move toward a more holistic view.
How so?
Well, there's much more attention now on the human and social side, engagement, equity, and also on tackling those big issues like governance, environmental sustainability, and the challenges of rapid urbanization within this smart context. We're even seeing specific concepts like the smart energy city gaining traction.
It's good to hear it's evolving beyond just gadgets. The study mentions some specific cities often cited as examples.
Yeah, cities like London, Dubai, New York, Hong Kong, Amsterdam, Singapore, Tokyo, Paris, Copenhagen. They often come up as places actively trying to integrate these smart city ideas. They're using tech in lots of different ways to try and improve services and quality of life.
But I assume it's not all smooth sailing. Does the research highlight potential downsides or challenges?
Oh, absolutely. While the potential benefits are clear, better quality of life, more efficiency, maybe economic growth, there are definitely significant challenges researchers are looking at. Things like data privacy, security, the risk of creating a digital divide where some people get left behind.
Right, equitable access is key.
Exactly. And also, critically, the long-term sustainability implications. Does all this tech actually lead to a genuinely more sustainable city in the long run? That's a big question being investigated.
Okay, that brings us to the third main theme: stakeholder engagement and implementation. It feels kind of obvious that you need to involve people, but what specific insights does the research offer?
Well, it strongly confirms that intuition. The research really hammers home that getting all the relevant stakeholders involved, government, businesses, community groups, ordinary citizens, is absolutely fundamental for urban planning to succeed.
It's not just a nice to have.
Not at all. It's about bringing those diverse perspectives and needs to the table, fostering a sense of, shared ownership and responsibility for the city's future.
Does the research point to specific ways that work best for engaging people, particular strategies?
Yes, it does highlight a few. Things like scenario planning, where you explore different possible futures together, public participation exercises, obviously, to get direct input, and using geospatial technologies, GIS, basically digital mapping, which can be really powerful for visualizing plans and helping people understand the potential impacts.
So better communication tools help.
Definitely. But the core seems to be about fostering open communication, real collaboration, and being flexible enough to adapt plans based on feedback and changing situations.
Sounds great in theory, but I bet there are hurdles in practice. What barriers does the research flag up?
Yeah, reality often bites. Common barriers include competing interests, different groups wanting different things. Limited resources, both financial and human, are a constant issue. And sometimes just institutional inertia, resistance to changing how things have always been done.
So how do you overcome those?
The research suggests it takes strong governance structures, actively building capacity within communities and institutions so they can participate effectively, and crucially, developing a shared vision for sustainability that actually motivates people across different groups.
It's really interesting seeing how these themes, frameworks, smart tech people all connect. Now, the study also looked at how the research focus itself has shifted over time. What were the key evolutionary trends?
Right, the thematic evolution part. Well, some terms like sustainability and sustainable development have pretty much always been central, which isn't surprising.
They're foundational.
Exactly. In the earlier years of the research they looked at, there was maybe more emphasis on spatial analysis tools, remote sensing, GIS. But then, starting around 2012, the term climate change really starts to climb in prominence.
Reflecting broader global awareness, I guess.
Almost certainly. And then what about more recently? What's really grabbing researchers' attention now?
Well, from about 2018 onwards, there's a noticeable rise in terms like urban economy and, very significantly, smart city.
Ah, the smart city again. Yep. It really points to this growing focus on how technology and economic factors are being woven into urban development strategies. The fact that smart city is flagged as a major trending topic suggests there's a lot of ongoing work and interest there.
Anything else trending or needing more focus?
The study also suggests that terms like sustainable assessment, integrated approach, and local government are areas that warrant more investigation. So thinking about how we actually do the assessment, how we connect different parts, and the role of city-level governance.
Okay, so we've talked frameworks, themes, evolution, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What specific indicators are researchers actually using most often to measure all this?
Good question. The study grouped the commonly used indicators into those four main dimensions we mentioned earlier: environmental, economic, social, and institutional.
Right.
And within each of those, certain themes or specific measurements tend to reappear frequently in the framework studied.
Can you give us some concrete examples? Let's start with the environmental dimension. What gets measured there?
Sure. Environmentally, common indicators revolve around water, things like consumption, water quality, access to sanitation. Mobility and transport is another big one, looking at traffic levels, but also public transport use and affordability. Waste is key: how much is produced, how much gets recycled.
Air quality, too.
Definitely. Air quality is crucial, often measured using pollutants like NO2, PM10, PM2.5, those fine particles. Energy is another major focus, tracking consumption, but also the share of renewable energy. Land use patterns are important. And of course, climate change indicators, frequently represented by CO2 emissions.
Okay, that covers a lot on the environmental side. What about the other dimensions? Economic, social, institutional?
Right. Economically, indicators often look at the city's overall financial health, its sort of economic power, and employment or unemployment rates.
Makes sense.
And social. The social dimension is quite broad. It includes education, things like literacy levels, school quality, health access to healthcare, quality of services, housing affordability, sufficient living space, safety and security, crime rates, accident statistics. Equity is a big one, often measured through income distribution, access to social infrastructure and services. Green space accessibility is increasingly recognized. And even cultural aspects, sometimes proxied by public spending on culture.
Wow, that's a wide net.
Yeah.
And institutional.
Institutionally, you might see indicators related to participation, things like voter turnout or the number of active civic groups, urban planning itself, whether the city has documented plans for sustainable growth, environmental management systems or plans, and governance indicators, sometimes looking at things like levels of public debt.
It certainly sounds like a comprehensive wish list of data points. But the study also mentioned limitations with current frameworks, didn't it? What are the main hurdles?
Yeah, it's not perfect. A major challenge is just the sheer inconsistency in terminology. Different researchers or frameworks might measure similar things but call them different names or group them differently. That makes comparison really tricky.
There's no standard language yet.
Not really. And linked to that, there isn't one universally accepted set of must-have key indicators that every city should track. Plus, and this is important, what's considered a priority can vary hugely between, say, developed and developing countries. Well, for example, certain environmental indicators might be top of the list in some wealthier nations, while basic social needs or economic development indicators might be much more pressing concerns in many developing cities. The context matters enormously.
Okay, so given all this research, the themes, the indicators, but also the limitations, what does this mean for people actually doing urban planning on the ground? How can they use this knowledge?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The study really points out this ongoing gap between all the academic research being done and how much of it actually gets used effectively in day-to-day planning practice.
Bridging that gap is key then.
Absolutely. One big implication is the need for these frameworks to be much more adaptable to the specific context, especially where data is hard to come by or the institutional setup is very different. We talked about maybe integrating indicators into master plans.
Right, making it part of the existing process.
Exactly. That could make them more practical and actionable. And fundamentally, the research reinforces that governance and participation aren't just add-ons. They need to be core components of any sustainability strategy.
Definitely sounds like there's more work needed to connect the research world with the planning world. Did the study itself acknowledge any limitations in its own scope?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
It's important to remember this review was based specifically on the Scopus database, which is huge, but it means it might have missed relevant research published in regional journals or what's called gray literature. Things like government reports, non-academic studies, and also were published in languages other than English.
So future reviews could cast a wider net.
Potentially, yes, to get an even fuller global picture. And, it's always crucial to look at these kinds of bibliometric trends and ask, what do they really mean for policy, for actual decisions being made in cities? That interpretation step is vital.
So if we were to boil it all down, what's the main takeaway for our listeners from this deep dive into urban sustainability indicator research?
I'd say the core message is that this field is really dynamic and growing fast. There's clearly a rising focus on smart cities and the role of technology. But alongside that, there's also this increasing understanding that we need more integrated approaches that are really sensitive to the local context, both for measuring sustainability and for actually achieving it.
Okay. And with that thought, maybe here's something for you, the listener, to mull over. As our cities keep growing and face these incredibly complex sustainability challenges, how do we make sure all this research, this huge body of knowledge on indicators, genuinely translates into real, tangible improvements for everyone living in cities? How do we effectively close that gap between academic insight and practical action on the ground? Maybe think about the indicators and trends we discussed today and how they relate to your own city or your understanding of where urban development is heading.